This is a download from BFM 89.9, the business station.
Good afternoon. This is Carla Sapsford-Newman, and this is The Bigger Picture on BFM 89.9. Today we have the honor of speaking with Tan Sri Dr. Michael Yeo, CEO of ASLI, the Asian Strategy and Leadership Institute. Tan Sri Michael Yeo has served as a senior advisor on a range of high-level issues facing Malaysia. These include the Royal Commission on Police and the Malaysian Competition Commission. Yeo is also Joint Secretary General of the Malaysia-China Business Council, the ASEAN Business Forum, and the Corporate Malaysia Roundtable. He was appointed to be Malaysia's representative with ambassadorial status on the ASEAN High-Level Task Force, which developed the ASEAN Connectivity Master Plan, focusing on ICT, education, human capital development, transport, power, and energy, which was adopted at the 17th ASEAN Summit. And he was instrumental in the recent ASLI 10th ASEAN Leadership Forum, which was entitled ASEAN at a Crossroads Towards a Common Future, Shared Prosperity, and Regional Stability. And he was also a leader at the World Chinese Economic Forum held here recently in Kuala Lumpur. So, welcome.
Thank you, Carla.
All right, so to start out with the most recent forum, the World Chinese Economic Forum. So can you talk a little bit about the goals for Malaysia at this forum and what you think that Malaysia accomplished by being involved with the forum?
The World Chinese Economic Forum is a very large event that was attended recently by 600 participants coming from 34 countries. Malaysia, as a host country, benefited from the visit of these overseas delegations coming from China, from Australia, from Europe, and also from India and the USA. The primary purpose of the forum is to look at China and how China's growth and development can impact on Southeast Asia as well as with the rest of the global economy. The forum enables Malaysia to showcase itself as a prime investment destination.
All right. So what are some of the long-term goals of Malaysia in relationship with China?
I think Malaysia and China has moved to a new level of relationship, particularly with the visit of the President of China, Xi Jinping, to Kuala Lumpur recently. And the two leadership, Malaysia and the Chinese leadership, has signed a 5-year strategic economic program that will further strengthen our bilateral economic cooperation across 11 sectors of the economy.
All right. And this is just one in a series of forums held in Malaysia recently. So also recently the Global Entrepreneurship Summit was held here in Kuala Lumpur. Why is Malaysia becoming the destination of choice for these sorts of world forums or particularly Asia-focused forums?
I think Malaysia has become an interesting case for many overseas forum organizers as well as people who are interested to attend forums because of the diversity that we have, because of the moderate leadership that our Prime Minister has tried to portray, that Malaysia promotes the movement of moderates, and also because within the region we are one of the most stable countries.
All right. Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about the recent ASEAN Leadership Forum, which was sponsored by ASLI, ASEAN at a Crossroads. Can you talk about what this crossroads is and what are the opportunities as well as challenges for Malaysia?
Yes, Carla, we feel that ASEAN is at a crossroads because there's 2 more years before we achieve the ASEAN Economic Community by 2015, where ASEAN is supposed to be an integrated community. And in that road towards 2015, there are a number of key challenges that ASEAN has to address. It has to be able to eliminate tariffs across the board. It has to be able to open up to foreign investments. And it needs to be able to promote greater connectivity among the ASEAN countries. So there are many challenges that we face. And it's really at the crossroads because the key decisions that needs to be taken have to be taken this year and next year to ensure that by 2015, ASEAN actually becomes an integrated community.
And do you think ASEAN is on track?
I think ASEAN is largely on track. There are challenges that ASEAN face, particularly in some of the developing countries of ASEAN. In ASEAN nomenclature, we call it the CMLV countries: Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, and Vietnam. The less developed countries of ASEAN need to be able to gear themselves up to the challenges of a more open economy and to allowing foreign investments into these countries.
And what can Malaysia's role be in helping to, shall we say, keep ASEAN on track?
I think Malaysia will have a very important role. In 2015, when the ASEAN Economic Community is supposed to be achieved, Malaysia would be assuming the chairmanship of ASEAN. And as chairman of ASEAN in that very key year, Malaysia would be able to play a role in determining the agenda for the ASEAN Summit meeting that will take place in Kuala Lumpur in 2015. And it is also a time when the East Asia Summit will take place. And in the East Asia Summit, the USA, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, India, and other European countries will be involved. And it will be an opportunity then for Malaysia and the East Asia partners to look into the next step as to what would be the future goals of ASEAN after we have achieved 2015.
Okay. Are some of the recent, shall we say, conversations and controversies around the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, are those sort of indicators of some of the tension points within ASEAN regarding trade, regarding tariffs, and these sorts of things, or is that just one subset of the many issues facing the bloc?
Well, the TPPA isn't really a matter that ASEAN is generally concerned with, because there are only very few countries in ASEAN that are involved in the TPP process. That is Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei. The other 6 countries of ASEAN are not involved in the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations. So, largely as a whole, ASEAN isn't too affected with the TPPA negotiations. ASEAN would be pursuing a different free trade agreement, and that is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, or RCEP in short. And that will be an agreement between the 10 ASEAN countries together with China, Japan, Korea, India, Australia, and New Zealand.
It seems like with increasing relations with China, and yet at the same time America's so-called pivot to Asia, Malaysia is sort of strategically in between. What do you think are some of the opportunities for Malaysia, and what are some of the challenges in sort of balancing our interests on both sides?
I think it's important for Malaysia as well as ASEAN to be able to balance our relationship with both China and the USA. Both are very key, very important partners for our country as well as for ASEAN. China has now become the largest investor in many of the ASEAN countries. China has also become the largest trading partner for ASEAN and for each of the ASEAN countries. And the bilateral trade between Malaysia and China and ASEAN have also increased substantially. Malaysia is now China's largest trading partner in ASEAN, and this shows the importance of China to Malaysia and to ASEAN. At the same time, the US is also equally important as a foreign investor here, and many of the ASEAN countries would want the US to be still actively engaged with our region.
And what do you think is the most common misperception about ASEAN here in Malaysia?
I think a lot of the common people here, the ordinary people in Malaysia, do not really see or recognize the enormous potential of ASEAN, because ASEAN has very much been led by governments, and it is perhaps the business community who would benefit from ASEAN integration. So ASEAN is appreciated a lot by government and business, but not very much by the ordinary people on the street or by the younger generation. I think it is increasingly important for ASEAN to be able to increase an ASEAN consciousness among the people of the region, particularly among the younger generation in ASEAN.
Why should consumers care about ASEAN and about the effects of its policies?
Well, if we are able to achieve the ASEAN integration and ASEAN economies open up with the economic community coming into place in 2015, it will mean that tariffs will be reduced or eliminated in many sectors, and with the elimination of tariffs, goods will be cheaper, so consumers will benefit from cheaper imports from other ASEAN countries.
Okay, but aren't some industries concerned that with reduced tariffs that some of the protections that they've enjoyed might be removed, and this could be, shall we say, remove them from competition?
I think the SMIs are perhaps a bit concerned in that regard, and many of the SMIs and many of the ASEAN countries, particularly in the CMLP countries, need to be able to gear up for more intense competition. And I think the next 2 years would provide a transition period for these SMIs to be prepared to manage the transition. They may have to relook the business model, they may have to relook at their production schedule to become more efficient, to become more productive, so that they can withstand the competition from imports from other countries.
An SMI, what does that mean?
A small medium industry.
Okay, I see. Or otherwise known as SMEs.
Yes, that's right.
I see. All right. So are government-linked companies in Malaysia concerned at all about ASEAN integration?
No, I think many of the government-linked companies in Malaysia will see it as a potential and an opportunity for them to move into other ASEAN countries as well. Because Khazanah Nasional, for example, owns a very large healthcare company, and the healthcare company have already got hospitals in Singapore and Indonesia, and with integration, perhaps they could move into other countries in ASEAN as well.
Okay. And what about Bumiputra companies? Are there more opportunities than potential threats for them, or?
If they are efficient, if they are productive, they should be able to see it as an opportunity. But if any company is not sufficiently efficient or productive, then of course they will face challenges from cheaper imports from other countries.
We've talked a lot about financial integration, but what about in terms of, shall we say, human rights or social standards and practices? ASEAN at the moment is a largely aspirational organization in that respect. So can you discuss some of the potential opportunities for the community to help, shall we say, spread and promote universal values such as human rights, women's rights, refugee rights, that sort of thing?
That is one of the most important challenges I think ASEAN faces in the post-2015 scenario. ASEAN has already adopted the ASEAN Charter for Human Rights and have established what is known as the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission for Human Rights and an ASEAN Commission for the Protection of Children and Women's Rights. Many human rights activists feel that the ASEAN Commission for Protection of Children and Women's Rights is a step in the right direction, and that will go a long way in protecting the rights of children and women. But many of these human rights activists also feel that the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights has not pushed the envelope further in the protection of human rights. The ASEAN Charter for Human Rights and the current Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights is more concerned now with the promotion of human rights in terms of educating the governments and educating public authorities on the importance of human rights and how to respect human rights. But there is not enough in terms of the provision for protection of human rights. And I think that this is something that we feel that ASEAN should tackle as a next step forward.
If you're just tuning in, we've been speaking with Tan Sri Dr. Michael Yeo, CEO of the Asian Strategy and Leadership Institute, or ASLI, on Malaysia's emergent role in the ASEAN community. You're listening to The Bigger Picture, BFM 89.9.
This is a download from BFM 89.9, the business station.
You've just joined us. We've been speaking with Tan Sri Dr. Michael Yeo, CEO of Asian Strategy and Leadership Institute, or ASLI, on Malaysia's emergent role in the ASEAN community. And we'll be speaking about opportunities and threats. So we concluded talking about human rights and about universal values and the potential opportunity of ASEAN. But yet one of the organizations in which you could argue is being modeled after the UN has been criticized for not having enough teeth. So is that a potential threat with ASEAN, that it will produce some very nice rhetoric but ultimately have very few enforcement powers?
Well, at the moment, the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights do not have any enforcement powers. And that is something that is lacking, something that civil society activists are lobbying the ASEAN governments to review the ASEAN Charter for Human Rights to amend the terms of reference for that Intergovernmental Commission to provide it with protection powers, that it can protect human rights, which means that it can investigate instances of human rights violation as well as to have some form of enforcement powers.
Right. You've served on several commissions. So talk about how your work with the Royal Commission on Police and the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission, as well as the Malaysian Competition Commission, inform the work you're doing and that ASLI is doing with ASEAN. How does that, shall we say, that experience influence the recommendations that you're making?
Well, I think that has been very useful to me. The participation in many of these commissions enabled me to gain very valuable insights on the workings of the police, as well as on the role of human rights in the country, and also in terms of how we can become a more competitive country by pursuing the need to eliminate anti-competitive behavior among Malaysian companies.
So what do you think is the chief impediment for Malaysia in terms of competition, based on your experience with the Malaysian Competition Commission? So what would you recommend that the government do or put into place before 2015 in taking on the leadership of ASEAN to become as competitive as possible in ASEAN?
I think there are many things that the government as well as the business community can do. Firstly, there has to be measures to reduce, if not to eliminate, monopolies and cartels in the country. The Competition Commission will take a very strong stance against anti-competitive behavior. Very recently, the Commission has taken a decision to impose a 10 million ringgit fine on both Malaysia Airlines and AirAsia for entering into an anti-competitive agreement, and that is intended to be a message to the business community that the Competition Commission do not take lightly to anti-competitive agreements. So I think there is a need to weed out anti-competitive agreements, particularly price fixing or cartel-like operations.
What about the Royal Commission on Police? Are many of the same challenges that Malaysia has faced, are those common to the region, or do you think sometimes people here in Malaysia think that our challenges are unique to Malaysia?
I think some of the challenges are quite common to the region. I think there's fear of crime. I think that is generally felt not only in Malaysia but throughout the region, and the need for the police forces in Malaysia and the region to be better equipped to combat crime, to reduce the incidence of crime. At the same time, the police needs to be modernized, to be more effective in carrying out investigations, in employing forensic science and investigative practices so that they are able to solve crimes more effectively. More importantly, also, is the awareness that the police forces need to have in terms of respecting human rights, and that's also the rights of criminals as well that needs to be taken into account. The Royal Commission of Police have come up with a recommendation to the government to establish an Independent Police Complaints and Misconduct Commission, or IPCMC in short, and that will hopefully be able to deal with misconduct in the police force and to be able to reduce instances of abuses of power within the police.
Okay, and do you think crime is also an investment issue as well for Malaysia and for ASEAN? So the perception of high crime, do you think that deters multinationals and foreign companies?
I think in some ways it would. There are some companies that have pointed out that the crime rate is worrying to them, and to having expatriate families living in the country.
Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission, is there a perception that corruption is one of the prime challenges facing ASEAN as it looks to become a stronger and, shall we say, more powerful regional bloc?
Well, corruption is a challenge that many of the ASEAN countries face, and corruption needs to be given greater focus by governments. I think some of the anti-corruption bodies in some of the ASEAN countries have been very effective in tackling corruption. In particular, Singapore's Anti-Corruption Bureau have been very effective in controlling or reducing corruption in Singapore. The Indonesian Anti-Corruption Commission is also very effective in tackling corruption. And we hope that the MACC here can also be able to learn from international best practices so that they can improve their powers to reduce corruption in the country.
All right, so what do you think Malaysia in particular could learn from the best practices of other countries such as Indonesia, Singapore?
I think firstly is to ensure that anti-corruption bodies are truly independent of the executive. I think independence is key and essential to fighting corruption and to increasing the effectiveness of the anti-corruption agencies. Secondly, to enable perhaps the MACC to have the powers to prosecute. At the moment, MACC still needs to refer cases to the Attorney General before corrupt cases can be brought to court. So empowering the MACC with the powers to prosecute can be another effective way.
Okay, thank you. The history of regional blocs has not always been a rosy one. So if you look at Latin America, if you look at Africa, if you look at even Europe at the moment, there's always rivalries and competitions and historic issues that tend to get in the way of regional cooperation. So what do you think are the opportunities for ASEAN, and what do you think are some of the challenges as it looks to coordinate more as an integrated body?
I think ASEAN has been actually one of the most successful regional blocs globally. Over the years, I think ASEAN has been able to maintain regional peace and stability. I mean, there's been no conflict in Southeast Asia since the Second World War. I think that's a big achievement for ASEAN. But I think going forward, ASEAN needs to be able to have in place conflict management mechanisms. Some years ago, the ASEAN Summit has proposed the establishment of an ASEAN Center for Peace, and that can be a body that can help resolve conflicts and maintain peace in the region.
Okay, will that help with some of the conflicts that have been in the news this year, such as the Spratlys or the China-Philippines territorial disputes, or some of the disputes of other countries regarding certain islands?
It has not, in the sense that the ASEAN Center for Peace was more an intra-ASEAN mechanism, whereas the South China Sea problem involves another external power, which is China. Recently, at the ASEAN Summit in Brunei, the Chinese Premier has proposed that ASEAN and China work out a new code of conduct for the South China Sea that will maintain peace and friendship and enable peaceful settlement of disputes and conflicts in the South China Sea. We are hoping that that code can be developed very quickly so that there can be a more peaceful environment in the region.
Okay, the leadership of ASEAN rotates.
That's right, the chairmanship of ASEAN.
The chairmanship of ASEAN rotates, and so Malaysia will step on into this chairmanship in 2015. But as it's only a one-year limited role, are there certain players that have stood out in terms of their influence or in terms of their ability to persuade or convince other members, or is it really the chairman country which takes the lead at any given time?
ASEAN has been an organization that has always worked on common denominators, and very often the ASEAN agenda is set by the ASEAN foreign ministers who would be the coordinating body for ASEAN, and very often they work on a consensus of what needs to be done. So very often the chairman of ASEAN do not really have too much of a role in shaping the agenda for ASEAN. The chairman of ASEAN can perhaps give greater focus in terms of prioritizing some of the common goals of ASEAN. But the broad general goals of ASEAN are always predetermined by the foreign ministers even beforehand.
Okay. Consensus is very difficult to achieve in any environment where there's so many players and with competing interests. So what would your advice be to Malaysia as we look to assume the chairmanship in terms of preparation and in terms of priorities?
I think the ability of the chairman to persuade the other countries is a key to getting consensus, and very often it is the persuasive capability of the chair that can help shape a consensus decision. Very often ASEAN adopts the lowest common denominators, and that is not the best for the region, in the sense that it is the easy targets that are achieved, but the more difficult goals are always kept in view because they couldn't achieve a consensus. And very often then it is up to the chair to be able to persuade the other countries to go along with what the chair feels are important priorities to address.
Do you feel there are any lessons to be learned, for instance, in the recent conflicts inside the, shall we say, balance of power arrangement in the United States, where it's been so difficult for the world's biggest superpower to achieve consensus with so many competing interests? Are there any lessons to be learned from these headlines for ASEAN in terms of, shall we say, what not to do?
I think most of us in ASEAN do have a different system of government from the US, fortunately, so that I don't think we would experience the deadlock that the US Congress now faces with the White House. And although perhaps in the US system that is democracy at work, I think hopefully those situations will not arise in any of the ASEAN countries.
And finally, Malaysia was chosen for the recent Global Entrepreneurship Summit. Do you think governments in Europe and the United States and the West and other countries are starting to recognize the importance of Malaysia in terms of the Asian or the ASEAN tiger phenomenon and the role that Malaysia can play in influencing and leading the region?
Well, I think many countries recognize Malaysia for the political leadership that it is developing and pursuing to promote moderation. I think that's an important agenda that many countries are beginning to see as a crucial way to move forward in a complex world. I think also many countries see Malaysia as an example of a multiracial, multicultural country being able to live peacefully and progress well. At the same time, there are also investment opportunities available here in Malaysia that many investors are looking at actively.
Okay. So you use the word moderate, and is this tied to the global movement of moderates?
That's right, yes.
All right. So what traction do you think that's gaining internationally? Do you think it's helping to raise the profile of Malaysia as a moderate Muslim country?
I think it does. I think in UK, Prime Minister Cameron is very supportive of that concept, and I think he's trying to adopt that for UK and Europe. ASEAN has already adopted the movement of moderates as a principle that ASEAN would use in carrying out its work in ASEAN, and the Prime Minister has also taken that message to the United Nations, and is also gaining acceptance in many other countries.
Okay, thank you. As a final note, if you were the chair, if you were the Prime Minister in 2015, what would your priorities be for ASEAN?
I would want to focus on a more people-centered ASEAN. I think, as we have spoken earlier, ASEAN now is only very relevant to government and business, but ordinary people in ASEAN don't really have that sense of belonging to ASEAN. So I think we would need to see how we can shape ASEAN to make it relevant to the ordinary people of ASEAN.
Thank you. We've been speaking with Tan Sri Datuk Dr. Michael Yeo, CEO of ASEAN Strategy and Leadership Institute, or ASLI, on Malaysia's emergent role in the ASEAN community. You've been listening to The Bigger Picture on BFM 89.9.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. To find more great